Life of my favorite man, Paul. And as usual, where do we find Paul on this Sunday morning? If he was still alive physically today, knowing his career and what happened to him throughout most of it, Paul would not be in a church service this morning. He would be in prison. And you know, he spent most of his life starting churches, started 20 of them in the early days after our Lord and Savior died, probably running from 32 or 33 A.D. to his final death physically, possibly in 64, 63 A.D. In other words, about 30 years or so. But where's Paul this morning? He's in prison. And where did Paul do his best thinking and writing letters to the churches? He wrote from prison. He evidently had a lot of time spending around to think about religion and what was happening in the churches that he had started. And he had a lot of problems with the churches that he started. You know, he started Ephesus, and that was one of his earliest churches, in fact, the first church that he started. Now he's getting letters and communications from other churches that had started about 8 or 10 years around that time that he would finish at Ephesus. You know, he spent 3 years at Ephesus. Sort of treated that like his hometown. But as we learned last week, he liked to visit the bigger towns. Well, today's story is not about a bigger town. It's about a town called Colossae, another small community in Greece. And it was roughly 120 miles from Ephesus, which doesn't seem like much today. Montgomery is 165 miles up I-65. But there was no I-65s in those days. There was no, well, I started to say there was no new cars. There were no old cars on the road. So Paul's journeys were mostly by land and by water getting to those small churches that he had started. And he got this information from a church that he did not start. Now, he had a small part in it. I think he more than likely sent Purvis to Colossae to start that church. And it was roughly the time that the church at Ephesus itself was started. And what was the problem at that church, or the problems? And looking back through the commentaries written about that time, they also wondered what Colossae's problem was. They had the letter from Paul that he wrote them, and they really didn't know what problems he was trying to solve at Colossae. And what seemed to be the problem was they were a church that believed in everything. I mean, everything. There were those there, and the church itself was composed of mostly Gentiles. Most of the churches that Paul started were, attended by Gentiles. You know, Paul was elected and appointed by Christ to go and visit the Gentiles, as Peter was designated the official representative of the Jews at that time. And so Paul's problems dealing with his whole career dealing with Gentiles. And what had happened in Colossae? You name it. What do you believe in? There were people in that church that believed in the comets, stars. They believed in the gods of the Roman gods and Grecian gods at the time, Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, Neptune, you name them. And there was a section of this church that believed in that. There were even people in this church that were believers in what later became known as agnostics, Gnosticians. Nobody really knew what they were. They were just people that believed in anything. The agnostics were. And they're still around today. But in trying to answer their problems, Paul wrote this letter. And most of his letters were full of theology, great words of wisdom that God had led him to teach and to those that were promulgating the churches where he was trying to live. This church was sort of unusual. As we said a few minutes ago, they allowed you to believe in anything and any combination. And there were some weird combinations there. Colossia was an unusual church. It was an unusual town. Not much is known of it in history. It was on the pathway to where all of the conquering hordes followed out of Alexandria and followed Peter the Great and all of that bunch into Russia and all, trying to conquer those foreign lands. But it was on that pathway. And then politicians moved that route, probably paved the road and left a dirt road running through Colossia. And the routes from the east, the victorious armies, was no more. So the Colossae died as a town. In fact, it had gone to the point where almost God had written it off. And maybe that was why Paul was getting these letters of problems there in Colossia. I don't know. The theologians themselves, in reading back to the letter, said, well, this was their problem. And Paul dealt with that in a part of the book. And another group would say, this is their problem. And Paul dealt with that with another part of his short letter to the Colossians. He was writing about a lot of different problems, basically in a church that had no theology whatsoever. Anything went. As an example, they worshiped angels. They even had several, what we would call sermons today, by preachers throughout the land that praised Gabriel, an angel that we hear the most about. All the ones that the early philosophers dealt with the coming attraction of the Messiah. But they also dealt with, like we said earlier, Juno, Jupiter. They believed that the stars held the answer to many of our problems. In other words, there are certain days when the stars were aligned with each other that you weren't to do anything at all because that was a bad day for citizenry. They didn't like the Sabbath because that was when these so-called gods were supposed to be let loose upon the universe to wreak their havoc. And so they pretty much wanted to do away with the Sabbath. And, you know, for the Jews, that was really anti-Jewish. But it became a problem for the later-day Christians because we celebrate the Sabbath on Sunday. And again, according to this special group of people, you don't want to go anywhere on a Sunday because those were the days that the gods were out there frolicking around. And we all know the stories of how they frolicked around with the human life on earth. Hercules, you know, was the son of a goddess and an ordinary individual, or a god and an ordinary individual woman. Who knows? But they believed in people like that. And that meant they went along with that philosophy. So he wrote the book of Colossia, the letter. It's referred to as several of Paul's epistles, which were called the prison letters. And all of them, he was dealing with some of these small, what we would call rural churches today, because they were all in smaller towns. Philemon from Ephesus was one of these rural communities and all. And so his letters from prison generally dealt with problems that could be solved on a theological basis. They were, well, let's put it this way, they were written with the idea of a more intellectual group than he was really dealing with. In other words, the ideas that he proposed and the theology that he espoused all dealt with problems that the ordinary church just wasn't dealing with. They were interested in what was Jupiter going to do today, and what was Juno going to do, and how was Apollo going to chase the sun across the sky. How do we have explanations for all of the so-called gods and their mannerisms? So he wrote this letter, and again, it's one of the prison letters. In it, he wanted to picture, as he continued to do throughout all of his letters, of Jesus Christ as the supreme Lord of the universe. In other words, we've got these other gods out there, but there's one real true God. And so he's talking to some people that's beyond their realm of thinking. How do you deal with Jesus as a God and put him in the same boat as Jupiter, who was a god? In other words, he was there just among the others. He was not a supreme deity. And yet Paul was trying to convey that knowledge to the people who are well versed in what the so-called gods could do and couldn't do. And he's bringing along this old guy that was born in a manger, born of the Virgin Mary. Well, he's just another one of the guys in the choir. He wasn't the lead singer in the choir or the leading bass or the soprano or whatever. He was just another one of the choir. This did not go over so well with Paul's fellow theologians. They were sort of at a disagreement. And the people in the churches that he was talking to didn't know who the heck he was talking about, because he was ascribing things, physical things that Jesus could do for them, spiritual things that Jesus could do for them that the other gods were already doing. And so it was a battle. And that's why the theologians that came along later wondered, what problem was it that Paul was going to try to solve? Well, his whole letter went from a couple chapters of dealing with family problems, man and wife problems, children's problems, within general natures of what you're going to do there in your household. And then he would jump over and talk about, well, don't worry about those other gods, because there is just one supreme God that's in charge of everything. Paul lacked the ability, while he was in prison, to communicate with the folks that he wanted to communicate with, because he spent most of his life there in prison. And the only people that were around him were Roman guards, Jewish guards, if in the Roman government, because they were mainly responsible for him going in and out of the jails. And it wasn't necessarily a real bad thing. Sometimes he was arrested and put under house arrest at his home. He could have folks come in and talk to him and things like that. But again, their prisons were like the ship drives that he was able to make later on his journeys. They allowed him room to live, but there was nothing there for him to live on. There was no water, no food. He was just able to ride the ships free. We said it was the equivalent of 2 days' wages to go 600 miles by boat. So he was really dealing with a group of people at another level. And he sort of got mystified himself about what problem can I really answer and give them an answer to. He would always come back to basically the only answer that was available to him, and that was that Jesus Christ was a supreme God. But how do you explain that to people that believed in a lot of gods? They were all supreme to them. Yes, there was one chief God, Jupiter. So he fought this battle with them and tried to teach them there was only one person that was able to forgive them of their sins. That was Jesus Christ. And through the shedding of his blood on the cross, where he bled and died, mankind was freed from having to make sacrifices of the animals around him. You know, the perfect animal, and they did away with that part of about it. Theoretically, it was supposed to do away with the worshiping of idols. And the Jews finally did get out of that awful syndrome they'd fallen into about going back. Even while Moses was coming down from the mountain, they were putting all their jewelry and all of their necklaces and gold and silver pouring into a pot, and it just up jumped an idol. They were worshiping idols at the time that Moses was getting the law from God himself about what they could worship and who they couldn't worship. Well, that continued on until they finally, through the penalty of God, which eventual death of all mankind was prophesied because of their sins, not following Jesus Christ as the Messiah. So Paul, he continued his struggles there, talking to them. And the book of Colossians really was an explanation, a very good theological explanation, one conclusion. And it's a hard conclusion. It's still being tried to be proven today by today's preachers. And that there is one God, one truly supreme being that you're going to be held accountable to no matter how many others you believe in. And Paul kept bringing up that they're just ordinary gods, you know, these others. He should have been saying there are no other gods. There is just one God. But he was pushing, this is the supreme God. So that was just another supreme God to the people he was talking to, and they were naturally confused. The ministry in Ephesus all emphasized the gospel as being really belonging not just to the worship of Jesus Christ, but as the only person that could be worshiped was Jesus Christ. And then they'd get this letter or communique from the Colossians where we're going to bow down and worship the angels. We're putting them up as a God. And the Bible itself is so contrary to this that in the book of Revelation, John was told not to bow down for the angels that were bringing the messages for the 7 churches and all the list of 7s that you had to follow and everything. The angels were not people to be worshipped. They were creations of God himself. God was the person that should be worshipped. Well, that did away with a little bit of their planetary theology and what to do on certain days and the moon. Oh, they carried along with Jewish teachings of eating special foods, being circumcised. To be a true Christian, you've got to be circumcised. They carried a lot of these false theories along with them. It was a struggle. And Paul answered it as well as he could, but he left all of the readers of the book confused as the ones that caused the writing of the book. They really didn't know what Paul was saying that answered the problems for that church because they had all kinds of problems. For whatever problem he tried to solve, he had to bring in the other problems that they had going along with it and that were also contrary to it. Because it wasn't just that the people believed that the stars rule their life. Hopefully, that would have died out a long time ago, when Jesus Christ was born. But, we still have people reading the horoscopes in the paper today, do we not? I'm guilty myself. I like to go in there and find out what famous thing or person had a great day today. And does my birthday fall within their sphere of influence? Ain't that stupid? I'm being no different than the people were there in Colossia. And God looked upon this and the book doesn't say this. It says one part of this, but it doesn't give the conclusion that I draw from it. Shortly after Paul tried to answer the Colossus problems, there was a terrific earthquake in the town of Colossia. And it was completely destroyed. Reminds you a little bit of the tornado that just swept through parts of Kentucky. A tornado that lasted on the ground for 150 miles, and we all saw the desolation and the destruction of the buildings and the trees and the loss of life. This happened to Colossia. Almost wiped it off the foot of the earth shortly after Paul wrote his letter. Now, I'm not saying that the effect on the Colossians was a direct result of God's intervention, but yes, I am. Because God intervenes in the life that he has created for the universe. The stars and the comets that go through the sky were creations of God. And yet he had people giving credit to the effect that stars and philosophers and stargazers and seers, the overseers of the world, were giving credit to an inanimate object that God created. And this was the message that Paul was trying to convey, that forget all that other stuff. God created everything. And God will be the one that has an influence on it. Well, the town was destroyed by earthquake. A few years later, people returned to Colossia, and they built the town again. Not the next day, not the next week, not the next month, but in a short period of time, God gave his answer again, and an earthquake again destroyed Colossae. They're still reading Paul's letter that he gave trying to solve their problems. And if you were to look on a map today, you wouldn't find Colossae. What happened to them? The Bible does say that in their explanations by some of the commentaries that it's just a mound of dirt today, 120 miles from Ephesus, that the excavators and those that examine the artifacts from foregone days haven't even decided to go through and dig down and find out what happened to Colossae. It's under a pile of dirt. The lesson you learn from all of this is that God has set aside that what people need to understand is that in time, not my time, not yours, but in his time, that everything that he says or does will be followed completely or else the result is, we call it death. A new way of a lot of your people say now, those that study theology, death is not what we call a physical death, but it's a complete absence of God. In other words, he doesn't exist, and they don't exist, and they don't talk to anybody. God has never gotten along with those that are sinful. In fact, he cannot exist in a sinful world. So you get a choice again to make. Believe it or not. Does God care? Yes, he cares. Jesus was sent not to save the Jews at that time from a permanent death. Jesus was sent in for all people, not just for the Jews, but for the Gentiles, which were adopted into God's original philosophy. But we still have Colossae. And in chapters 1 and 2, your exhortations by Paul was to live a Christian life. In other words, the answer to everything is just be a Christian. Treat everybody nice, and he had a whole system of things they were to do, and then he gave them a whole list of things that they were to avoid. And as we know, most of the things that he told them to avoid were all pleasurable things, you know. Don't worry about people around you. Do what gives you great comfort and ease in your own life, and let the world take care of itself. Well, that's a line of thinking that has persisted and has always lived there with the choices that people have to make. Paul came back in the final chapters and he changed what he was trying to cure them of. Again, it got back down to live a Christian life. And then he had to describe to them the Christian life involving the family and what the man should feel towards a woman, you know, the general things that he covered in some of the letters, like from Timothy on down in the Bible that he helped Timothy write most of the times. It's just as this seems odd that there's always, whatever reason that a person or a place has for existence, the final decision rests with, are they following God's plan, which he has for everyone? Jonah we talked about. Jonah was the only prophet that ever disobeyed God. And to his death, while he was sitting up on the mountaintop waiting for the destruction of Nineveh, where he had been brought back from the belly of the whale 3,000 miles because he was supposed to tell Nineveh what was going to happen to them if they didn't acquiesce and come around to God's way of thinking. And when God didn't immediately destroy Nineveh, and Jonah sitting up there on the mountaintop, his faith wasn't increased by the fact that he'd been saved from the belly of the whale, and that he was following God's orders. He was saying, God, told you these people were going to do all of this, and what did you say you were going to do? You were going to destroy them. And you're letting the folks at Nineveh escape with nothing at all. He said, I did all this for nothing. You brought me back for nothing. And God looked at him and he said, you can't even find within your heart that I can forgive any sin eventually if it's made with a heartfelt warmth and sincerity of an honest person. And Jonah, still in a self-pitying mode, said, this ain't for me. Less than 100 years later, which to us is a long time, but in the eye of God is just the flip of your fingers. 100 years later, Nineveh was destroyed and ceased to exist. So the promise God made to Jonah was fulfilled, not to give God the feeling of what I say goes, feeling of glory, but to show Jonah that even though you prophesied what I had already told you was going to happen, and it didn't happen when you wanted to, it was going to happen because it was the right thing to do. And yes, God has planned for you and your life. It may not take effect fast as you would want it to. You may exist on in that state of perpetual disillusionment and feeling that you're still in charge of life. But think back on poor Colossia. One earthquake destroyed it completely, wiped it out, left everybody without a home. And they came back and lived the same life they had left dead before, and didn't make any corrections along the way. In spite of Paul's letter, in spite of all those that proposed to solve your problems the way God intended, Colossia was destroyed again. And you can't find it in existence on any map today. Right now, it is a mound of clay and dirt that your great lookers into the past, those that study the rocks, those that study the soil around them, find any sign of life where God had destroyed that town. Your way, my way, is not God's way. And we all worry about, well, it didn't happen today when I asked for it. I prayed that such and such would happen. And God said that He would answer every prayer. But He also said it may not be the answer that you wanted. Just because it wasn't what you wanted doesn't mean that your prayer was not answered. And we as Christians have got to learn that what God intends is going to happen. And if it turns out to be what you liked, well and good. But the thing to remember is it wasn't done to please mankind. It was do it because it was God's will that it be done. And if you just happen to fall in that boat that it was good for you, then you say, my prayers were answered. But if you're in a boat that sank under the storm and caused Jonah to change his life, might be the same one that happens and changes your life. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you again for allowing us to come to study thy word and to learn about some of the cities and the background of those cities that as we came into existence years and years after their birth, we see the results of what happens when God's will is not followed. And the only thing that we can be certain of, and we do this with all intent of learning, so that we don't make the same mistake again, is God's